Good afternoon and welcome to the final concurrent session of the day, evaluating students through self-evaluation. Our presenters today are Laura Driver and Kevin Moore, faculty members at County College of Morris. If you have any questions for the presenters during the session, please feel free to enter those into the Q&A section at the bottom of the Zoom room screen, and we will address them at the end of the talk. On that note, I will hand it over to our presenters.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Just give me 1 second and I'll get the PowerPoint up. Okay. So I'll get us started. So again, good afternoon. My name is Professor Kevin Moore, and I'm with Professor Laura Driver today. Again, we're from the County College of Morris, and we're talking a little bit today about engaging students through self-evaluation. So just a little bit of background on this. Our goal was to try and rethink the way we approach developmental English at County College of Morris. So to that end, we just prepared a little bit of background to explain what our rationale was, what our thinking was when we were making the changes to our Dev Ed courses at CCM. So in a recent article from the New York Post that was provided to me by a colleague, they explained that nearly half of all of New York City public school graduates who head to local community colleges are forced into remedial classes to survive their first semester. This wasn't something that really surprised either Professor Driver or myself. An increasing amount of students are finding their way into developmental courses when they're just starting at the college level. And this was especially true in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, where student test scores and absenteeism have reached a new high. Yet ironically, graduation rates for high school inched up last year and nearly 84% compared to 73% 4 years earlier, with lower standards paving the way. So we've seen an increasing amount of students enter our classes who are just not ready for the rigors of a college education, especially when entering their English and math courses. Laura, do you want to add anything to that before I move on?
No, what Kevin is doing here is giving us background that is very relevant. He's going to give us a little bit more of that on the next 2 slides, and then I'm going to talk a little bit greater length at how that corresponds to the challenges we're facing at our specific institution, which I think line up very much with both tri-state area trends, but also trends nationally.
So with students increasingly underprepared for the rigors of the college experience, we were thinking a little bit more about whether or not developmental math and English courses are the best way to remediate students. Or is there a better way of doing it? Is there a better way of getting students ready for college level English in our case? So what does remedial English look like? What we did was we provided a bit of an overview of what our developmental courses looked like prior to the fall of 2022, before we redesigned our class, choices for students. Students were placed into one of 3 possible courses. The first was writing skills. This was a 15-week class with a strong emphasis on grammar. So students had to complete 3 objective multiple choice exams, a final exam, and a 5-paragraph essay. In order to pass the class and move on to the credit level English Comp 1, they had to earn at least a 70% or above. If they weren't placed into the 15-week class, they might have been placed into elements of writing. This was essentially the same class as writing skills, except it was condensed into a 7-week format. It maintained the same requirements as the 15-week class, but it met twice a week for 2 hours and 45 minutes. So holding students' attention for that amount of time when you're mainly talking about grammar was difficult, to say the least. And then the last class we offered was called Writing Skills Review. This was a 12-day writing workshop. It was geared towards students who were determined to be close to proficient, but not quite there yet. And if they passed this workshop, they'd be able to move into English Comp 1. But one of the problems with these courses was that they were non-credit bearing. So students who were placed into these classes, if they did not pass whichever one of these courses they were in, they would have to retake it until they did eventually earn the required score so that they could move on to English Comp 1, the credit bearing course. But there were some other problems.
I'll just add there that that model of those 3 possible classes that a student could be placed into remained the same for largely, as far as my experience goes back, at least 15 years. Those classes remained unchanged, including the content that was required in them. So it was standardization of content across all sections of those classes, with a good intention that any student who took those classes would come out with the exact same level of knowledge. But the problem is that the classes and the people responsible for administering them were not considering the changing needs of students leaving high schools in our area, but also, as I said, on a larger national level. There grew a divide between the preparation in high school and then what was expected in college. So even students who successfully passed those classes were not always prepared for the writing demands of both the credit-bearing English classes, but also the other classes in sociology, psychology, history that all required them to have taken those classes. So there was a great disparity between the preparation those classes required and offered, and then also what students were really capable of doing once they left those classes. And as Kevin said, they're non-credit bearing classes that delayed students from taking their credit bearing classes, sometimes for multiple semesters. The repeat rate was very, very high. And that corresponded also with a higher tendency for those students to eventually drop out of the college before they ever completed their program or successfully transferred.
These problems were only exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic as well, because these classes were still in effect during the pandemic, but we were on Zoom teaching these classes, which made it even more difficult. And then we started to recognize what some of the other problems were over time, which I've listed here. One of which was teaching grammar to students who have not already mastered the basics at the college level are really not likely to do so in a developmental course. Students don't necessarily have the attitude that the grammar or the writing is necessary for their future. So it's not a class that they come into and feel enthusiastic about. Objective-based exams can be intimidating for students as well. Those that do understand the material may not be able to show this through the exam format, which Laura was just explaining. We've seen students before who can participate in the class. They do quite well. They seem like they understand the material, but then when they're put in a situation where they have to take an exam, they don't necessarily earn the highest score. And this puts them in a situation where they have to repeat these courses, in some cases, up to 3 or 4 times, and they're never able to make progress towards graduation. It's also no secret that grammar is a dry subject. Students are not necessarily interested in it from the moment they walk in the door, and it's difficult for the instructor to make it exciting for students to learn grammar as well. And then finally, knowing the material for an exam will not always translate to stronger writing. We saw this issue as well, where some students would do quite well on their exams. They'd earn high scores, but then when they'd have to do the writing, they would be making common errors. They'd have run-ons, they'd have fragments, among other types of issues. So it was just clear that these classes, as they were not preparing students for the writing that they needed to do in Comp 1 and eventually Comp 2.
So it was definitely a problem of actual preparation and not necessarily getting what they needed, but it also becomes, an investment and a psychological issue. Students are not happy to be put in these classes, obviously, because it became equivalent to something of a punishment to be placed into these classes instead of it being an opportunity to strengthen skills that they hadn't gained before. It was definitely associated with a level of failure even prior to taking the class. And that really discouraged students for many, many, many years.
Anecdotally, I saw students who took writing skills as many as 4 times. And when you think about that, it's a 15-week class. That meant that they were at the college for 2 years trying to pass this one course, and in some cases were never able to. So there was definitely a problem with the way we were approaching Dev Ed prior to the changes that we've made that we're about to get into. Why do so many students require remediation? We did a little bit of research just to find some answers on this. And one thing that we know from having spoken with local high schools is that writing has been de-emphasized in K through 12. Many students who come into our classes have told us that they've never had to write a research paper before. Some have even told me that they've never had to write longer than a 5-paragraph essay. So they're not doing an incredible amount of writing, especially in middle school and high school. And I mentioned earlier that some students don't consider writing proficiency as necessary for their future endeavors. I think many English instructors have probably encountered students who have said, well, I'm not going to be an English major, so why do I need to know this? Why do I have to write this paper? Why do I have to analyze this book? They don't understand that the writing will become necessary for really everything that they'll do at the college level and really beyond in many of their career paths as well. And then finally, some teachers do not feel comfortable with their ability to teach writing nor prepare students for college level writing. This was something that we found in our research that showed that there are teachers who, despite having taken college level classes, don't really feel enthusiastic about having to teach writing in the first place because of the time that goes into it, especially with the grading. So I just wanted to share a quick quote from an article. This was in the New York Times. It was titled "Why Kids Can't Write." It was published in 2017 by Donna Goldstein, and she wrote that 3/4 of both 12th and 8th graders lack proficiency in writing, according to the most recent National Assessment of Educational Progress. And 40% of those who took the ACT writing exam in the high school class of 2016 lacked the reading and writing skills necessary to complete successfully a college English composition class. 40% is not a small number. And like we mentioned earlier, we're seeing an increasing amount of students who are not moving directly into college level writing, they're placing into these developmental courses. So seeing these numbers isn't exactly surprising. In that same article, Goldstein was also talking about teachers and how they feel uncomfortable with their ability to teach writing to their students. She wrote in a 2016 study of nearly 500 teachers in grades 3 through 8 across the country, conducted by Gary Troya of Michigan State University and Steve Graham of Arizona State University, they found that fewer than half of educators had taken a college class that devoted significant time to the teaching of writing, while fewer than a third had taken a class solely devoted to how children learn to write. Unsurprisingly, given their lack of preparation, only 55% of respondents said that they enjoyed teaching the subject. This is another relatively high percentage that we're seeing here of teachers that don't necessarily enjoy teaching the subject. And interestingly, last semester, I had a student who mentioned to me that he had never received a paper back from a teacher before that had any comments on it. He was only used to ever seeing a rubric with categories circled. And this is something I comment quite heavily on my students' papers so that they have an idea of what they did right, what needed improvement. But I think that this ties into this idea of teachers not necessarily enjoying the process of having to grade papers and not feeling comfortable with their ability to do it, to prepare students for the college level.
This also connects to something that it's been a very strong trend that I have both heard from my students, but also heard directly from teachers. We teach in a very large county, and we have a number of very different sending high schools, but we're part of a strong consortium with those high schools that regularly meets throughout the year to try to connect what we're doing with what they do so that their students that they send us are, not facing these challenges. And teachers in those meetings we've had have been very forthright about their own insecurity when it comes to evaluating. So it's not just feeling unprepared to teach students writing, especially writing that's going to be successful at the college level, but they feel unequipped to evaluate that writing, and so they tend to inflate the grades. Is not my own summation. It was actually something they admitted to. They felt it was better to bolster students' confidence with a higher grade rather than discourage them with a grade that might be more accurate. And that is part of what then creates a very compounding effect when they're placed into classes that show that they are not ready for college level writing. So that's another thing that has contributed to the many challenges we were facing here.
What you just mentioned also speaks to students who have perhaps higher expectations for what their grades should be when they get to our classes, because we've encountered many students who will complain if we put a C on their paper. They might say to us, well, they got A's and B's in 4 years of English in high school. So that sort of creates this, call it like a misunderstanding between us and the students because they feel like they're being graded too harshly. So we designed, now we're getting into our solution to all these problems. That was all a lot of buildup to explain what we've done at CCM to try and remedy these problems. We designed 2 new courses that replace the 3 developmental English classes that I mentioned earlier. The first is called English Composition 1 CW, and the CW stands for Composition and Workshop. And then there's English Composition CL, Composition and Lab. What both of these courses accomplish is that they integrate developmental English into the credit-bearing composition course. So the students are able to earn their credits, their developmental credits within the same semester. English Composition 1 CW is a 6-credit course. 3 credits are college credits, and then 6 are institutional credits. They incorporate elements of DevEd courses such as grammar and sentence types. And this course also emphasizes in-class writing with support from the instructor in an extended time frame. This class meets twice weekly for 150 minutes. And while that sounds,
sorry, Kevin.
that's okay.
This was answering one of the largest struggles that I saw, both as just within my own department, but then also as an instructor for both of these classes. In the prior model, not only was the content of the developmental courses very different than the credit-bearing Composition 1 course, but the instructor was often different. So you had a large divide both in time and in mindset from the people responsible for the developmental part and the people responsible for the credit-bearing classes. And integrating these into one course with the same instructor, providing the support, but also doing the grading that was for the credit-bearing class, answered a huge struggle that we had. And so it really, though we're only in our 2nd semester of this, I have seen a tremendous difference in the investment level in the instructors themselves, because there's more at stake when you are doing all of it in one semester. So 6 credits looks like a lot of time, but it's actually, I don't think that any of the students that we've had so far go through this, or the instructors would say that it is too much time. I think it has been the perfect amount of time, if I might say. Kevin's going to talk about the 4-credit version.
Right. Yeah, there are definitely benefits to the 150 minutes that we, meet with them twice weekly. And the 4-credit class is essentially the same idea as the 6-credit class. It's designed for students who demonstrate through placement testing or multiple measures that they're nearly proficient for standard college level English, but not quite there yet. It maintains the same elements as the CW class, except this class meets twice weekly for 100 minutes. So it's a little bit less time. We want to talk now a little bit about the benefits of both of these new courses, one of which is that in the old developmental courses, grammar was essentially the whole package. We taught grammar for 15 weeks, and it was very difficult to hold the students' attention, when that's all you're going over. We still have grammar instruction in these courses, but the students are not evaluated with objective-based exams, and we're not spending entire classes on grammar. We do grammar reviews based off of what we feel like our students need, observed through their writing. These courses, as we've explained, also integrate the remedial English into the credit-bearing college level English. So students no longer have to take a remedial course and then pass it to move on to English Comp 1. This is perhaps one of the biggest selling points of the class. So we no longer see students stuck in this loop of Dev Ed for 2 or 3 semesters. They are now in essentially a Comp 1 class, and if they pass it, they can move right into Comp 2 the next semester.
It's also not keeping them, it's also allowing them to register for classes in other disciplines that require Composition 1 as a prerequisite. So they are able to take their history and sociology and psychology classes, and even some biology classes that our institution require Composition 1 as a concurrent or a prerequisite.
The extended class time, 150 minutes or 100 minutes might sound like a lot of time, but we make very good use of that time in the classroom because students can work closely with their professors and complete the majority of the writing in the classroom. This also cuts down on the amount of homework that students need to complete and the amount of grading for the professor. So in my situation, I am virtually only grading when final drafts of papers come in. If we do exercises in class, if I give them a worksheet, we have the time. We can do it. We can go over it together, and I have to grade very little outside of the papers, which is really I feel like I get a little bit of a reprieve with this class when it comes to the grading because we have so much time that we can use it in the classroom.
I also use a lot of the time to work in multiple individual conferences along the way to that final draft because I think that's important for anyone in their first composition class in college, but especially for these students. Many of my students expressed to me that they have never had someone sit next to them and explain to them why something is right or wrong in their own writing. You know, these composition classes do not work well, I think, as solely lecture-based classes, but by the sheer number of students, that's how we have to teach it. But with the extra time that we have, I feel like I'm able to show my students how to use that time better so that they are able to structure their own writing time better once they're outside of that class. And that's one of the biggest benefits, I think, because they are not feeling like they have to go home and answer a prompt without any idea of how to organize it. If they attend and they are there for the time, it's impossible to fail the class. So that was a big part of the structure that we felt like was going to be a strength.
We'll talk more about that too, but I think that what Laura was speaking to is something that I've heard from a lot of our colleagues as well. Many of our colleagues are spending that time conferencing with their students because we have the time for it now. So we no longer have this, short 75-minute period to try and rush through conferences. We actually have the time to sit down with each of them one-on-one, and I think that's a great selling point. So these are the requirements for both of the new courses. The syllabi are virtually identical for each class. There are 4 required essays that rise in percentage value. So we start off with a narrative that's worth 10%. Essay 2 and 3 are each worth 15%. We do a compare and contrast and then division or analysis. And then we end with essay 4, the argumentative, at 20% of their grade. Once they've completed all of those essays, they put together a final portfolio at the end of the semester that's worth 30% of their grade. So you can see here that if you add all this up, 90% of their grade is coming from the writing. So as Laura just mentioned, if they show up, if they do the writing and they work with us, it's virtually an unfailable course. But you'll see here at the bottom, we've got these self-grading exams. This was something that we spent a lot of time thinking about and planning into our courses. For each of the 4 essays above, students are required to grade themselves before submitting their papers to the professor for a final grade. So we'll talk now a bit about how this self-grading works and why we think it's been successful so far. How does it work? First of all, I just want to mention that we refer to the self-grading as exams for a few reasons. First, the term carries more weight. We didn't want the students to consider this activity as just an extra credit opportunity. And when I was doing the research on this, the research suggested that some schools do it that way. It is extra credit, but students don't necessarily take advantage of extra credit all the time. So we thought that by referring to them as exams, they were more likely to take the process seriously. But the students are also more likely to carefully critique their work when they know that successfully doing so will lead to a higher grade.
And the whole point of this is to get students invested in using the rubric that we are going to use to evaluate them as a tool to guide their own revisions and their own essays instead of just, I think Kevin and I both for many years have taught our other classes and been very transparent about our rubrics and provided them to students, and students will not use them or are not they don't have the training to understand how to interpret the rubric and how it might help them. So the point of making this a required part of the class is that it actually becomes a tool for them to understand how to improve their own work and to be much more connected to the process by which they're going to be evaluated. And to kind of demystify that process and get them thinking from the mindset of someone evaluating their work instead of just reading their work.
I think it's also helpful because, like we mentioned earlier, it makes the students think about their writing more critically. They're no longer, I didn't have one situation last semester where a student argued with me about a grade because they're using the rubric we created. It's very simple to use. They don't have any difficulty with it at all. And when they look at that rubric and understand how we would use it, they're not necessarily jumping to give themselves A's. They're starting to understand that they can't be that generous with their grading. So how does it work? How does this process work? On the day a final draft is due, students grade their own essay, and these are the requirements. Students should make line edits addressing any errors they find, such as grammatical, mechanics, or sentence structure. If they identify something as a run-on, they can underline it and just write run-on above. Whatever the errors that they think they see, they should make a note of it as they go. They should also make notes in the margins noting errors in organization and focus, or if they have a weak thesis or a weak conclusion. Then on the last page, they use the rubric that we provide them to determine their letter grade. And then right underneath that, they write a short paragraph of 5 to 8 sentences minimum, justifying the grade that they awarded themselves. So it's just meant to give us an idea of what was their line of thinking. How did they arrive at this particular grade? And the one thing that I explain to my students is just, we don't expect them to become professionals at this. They're not necessarily going to grade themselves as effectively as a professor might do it, but they should still be able to think critically about their writing. If they're making errors in mechanics like capitalization, that's something they should be able to see relatively easily.
And the rubric is also a way that we work in evaluation of the grammar that is no longer part of objective tests. The grammar mechanics is, a full section of the rubric. And so the way I've structured my own class, and I think other instructors who are teaching these classes do the same, is for each essay, I try to focus on 2 or 3 major categories of grammatical mistakes so that when it's time to evaluate the essays, both in peer review and then in the self-grading, students know that we're looking at, we're really focusing on sentence fragments and comma errors in this particular essay. And I found that that's a better way to connect the grammar skills we're trying to teach them with a holistic process of actually what does that look like and sound like in your own writing and in other people's writing. And I have actually expanded the amount that I make my students write. So, here we're indicating a short paragraph. I've made them the last few times do much longer, multiple paragraphs where I'm asking them to quote their own work and show me evidence to justify what they're giving for each category of the rubric. Because again, it becomes mandatory. It's forcing them to go back through their own writing. So if they're going to give themselves a poor grade, they have to show me why specifically they think they really deserve that lower grade. Because as Kevin's going to show you, it doesn't help them to just grade themselves down. The goal is to be as close to accurate as possible, not just to give yourself a low grade in order to be safe.
That's what we have coming up next, how the papers are graded. So essentially the students are earning 2 grades for each paper. They will grade themselves, but the grade that the professor determines is the one that the student receives for the paper, which I'll explain in the rubric in just a moment. But then the student also earns a grade based off of how accurately their score matches with the professor's. And we created a rubric for this. So if you take a look at this rubric, there are a few possible grades. They can get an A, which is the equivalent of a 95, a B minus is an 80, a C is a 75, and then a D or an F is a 65 to a 55. So let's say the student earns an A. This happens if there's a half letter grade difference from the instructor's grade. So for instance, if students give themselves a B, but the instructor gives the student a B minus or an A minus, then the student would earn an A for the exam. So just for instance, if the student gives himself a B, I give the paper a B minus, they're going to get a B minus for the paper, but an A for the exam. And the same is true if the student gives himself a B, but then I give it an A minus. If there's a half letter grade difference, there's still going to get an A for the exam. But whatever the paper grade is that the professor determines is what they will get on the paper. The student earns a B minus if there's a full letter grade difference. So for instance, if the student gives him or herself a B, but the instructor gives him or her a C or an A, then the student would earn a B minus for the exam. The idea here is, as Laura was just explaining, they need to be as accurate as possible. So it doesn't help them to grade themselves lower than what they should earn. They should try to be accurate. If they would get a C if they're a letter grade and a half to 2 full letter grade difference. And then a D or an F is completely unsuccessful. There could be as much as a 3-letter grade difference. Just in my experience, I've seen very few Ds and Fs on these exams, with the majority of the grades being in the A and B range. Anything you want to add, Laura, before I move on?
No, my experience was the same. I have had literally one student get a D on the self-grading, and that person was willingly doing as a joke. So, and he acknowledged that. So it was not a dedicated effort that led him there.
There were a few benefits that we, after having done this for a full semester in the fall, that we noticed that there are more than a few benefits to this process. First of all, over time, the amount that the instructor needs to comment on the paper is reduced, especially by the time you get to that third and fourth paper of the semester. The students actually get quite good at noticing their own errors. And because of that, when we get those essays, we don't have to comment as much. I noticed last semester that I was getting through an entire stack of papers in as little as a day, whereas it never used to be that way in the past. Students also become more proficient at critiquing their own writing because they have this rubric that's, as we said, it's very easy for them to use. It gives them a clear outline of what they should be evaluating when they grade themselves. Students learn to manage their expectations when they receive their graded papers. So I've had far fewer instances in these classes of students arguing with me about their grades because of the rubric. Again, they have an understanding of how they're being graded. Now, even the research mentioned this next point. While students tend to inflate their grades early on in the semester, this should lessen over time. Of course, you might have some students, like Laura mentioned, that might not take the process seriously, but I found it to be quite rare that a student would give themselves an A when I would give the paper a D or an F.
Right.
They know when they haven't done well on a paper, and they're usually very honest with their grades.
And we're doing this whole process in class. The whole class is self-grading on a given day. And with my classes, we make it in, even though it's an individual process, at a certain point in the semester, the class becomes comfortable enough that people are commenting on the process out loud as they're doing it. And so they become very comfortable with being honest with one another, which is sometimes a bigger check than even what I'm going to say about the paper. They almost become, some of my students become competitive with one another about getting better at the self-grading. And so it's a very interesting investment part of the class that I have not been able to figure out anything else that could work this well.
We mentioned earlier as well that it's impossible to fail the course by failing the exams. The majority of their final grade comes from the essay writing itself. So the students come to understand very early on that these exams, these self-grading exams, they serve as a buffer, especially to help the struggling students raise their averages by allowing them to demonstrate their revising and editing ability. And I'm just going to go back for a minute to the breakdown of the grades. You'll see that the self-grading exams, it's worth 10% when 90% is coming from the writing itself. So if, in a worst case scenario, they were to fail all 4 of these exams, if they did well on everything else, they could still earn a fairly decent grade in the class. So we explained to the students that you want to do well on these self-grading exams because it serves as if one of these essays ends up not being a very high grade for them, the self-grading could help them, help them get out of the class at the end of the semester. Okay. So this process that we developed here, this is sort of a template that we developed for the faculty teaching this class, but it's also very, the faculty understand that they can make any changes that they see fit if they're teaching the class. So this is more, like I said, more just a template of how it should work in practice. On the first day of class, when an essay is assigned, the students would brainstorm an outline and write a preliminary draft. But again, this is all done right in the classroom with the help of the professor. So there really shouldn't be any homework, any necessary homework after this first class. When they come in on the next day of class, say it's a Monday, Wednesday class, they would do this on the first day of class. And then on the Wednesday class, they would come in, they'd peer review, they'd get feedback from their professor, they'd make revisions, and then they would complete a second draft. Ideally, by the end of this second class, they should have a completed draft. If we're asking for a 2 to 3 page double-spaced paper, they should be able to accomplish that in 2 days of class. Once they've finished that second draft, that's when I tell the students that if necessary, they can begin to make edits at home in preparation for the final draft because they've completed the majority of the writing in the classroom. So there shouldn't be too much of a difference between that the second draft and the third draft that I will eventually receive from them. When they come in for the third class, they would make any quick final edits that they need to. They could ask me questions as well or their instructor, and then they would do the self-grading process that we just went over. And then once the instructor finishes with the grading process, we meet with our students to discuss the grades with them. Some professors choose to do it after the first two papers and then after the last two. Others choose to do it after every paper, which is how I've been doing it. I think it's important to have at least quick 5-minute meetings with the students to sort of consult with them and let them know why they got the grade they did. Now, these last few slides is just, there's some data here that we wanted to share. Because we've just started this process, we don't have data for everybody who's been teaching these classes so far. But so I included just my class that I taught in the fall of 2022. This is the grade distribution for the self-grading exams. So you'll see for all 4 essays, the majority of the students earned an A or a B- on the self-grading exams. Only 2 students for the narrative essay earned a D or an F. And I know that the one student who earned the D or the F on the last 2 exams, this was just because she stopped showing up for the class. So, she wasn't even taking the exams at this point. But everybody was earning at least, for the most part, a C or above on all of these self-grading exams, which I think is great compared to what we were seeing in the old developmental courses where students were not always passing those required exams that they had to take, the module exams. This is an overview of results from my fall class. So you can see that every student is pretty much flatlined here. 2 students earned, for the most part, each grade. There were 2 A-, 2 B+, 2 Bs, and so on. I had 1 C+, and I had 2 students earn a D, and then 1 earned the F. And again, the one who earned the F was the student who just stopped showing up for the course. The 2 who earned the D, they did technically pass the course, but a D is problematic because it's not always a transferable grade. So the students in this case have the option of either retaking Comp 1 or moving right into Comp 2. And then the last slide I have here just shows the pass-fail rate, where I had 11 students out of 14 who passed. That was 78.6%, where the 3 students earned the D or below. And again, just to reemphasize, those students who earned Ds, they actually did move on to English Comp 2. Whether or not they've passed, I don't know yet. The semester is still in progress. But I was just very happy to see that the majority of students did successfully complete this course and move on.
So Kevin's given us here his own class as an example of a snapshot, but I manage all of these classes, and so I do get the results for all of the professors. So the other classes very much follow similar percentages as he's showing us here, both for the self-grading and for the passage rates. We mentioned one of the largest struggles of the developmental courses in the prior model was a high repeat rate, and there were failures, very high percentage of failures in the way that English writing skills and writing skills review were taught. This time, again, even though we've only had 1 complete semester, it was incredibly encouraging to see that we only had across 8 sections of these classes, 8 sections of the CW and 8 sections of CL. So that's 16 classes with 17 students in each class. It's a tremendous number of students relative to the overall population that takes English Composition 1. There were only 2 failures that were not based on attendance. And that's exceptionally better, exponentially better than the rates we saw before. So attendance issues are something that we struggle with in all of our classes, but even the attendance failures were significantly lower than we were seeing in writing skills. And that is tremendously encouraging, because the hope with this was not just that students were going to be better prepared, but that their investment in their own education would be stronger because they were getting more time with one instructor, and that there was a more cohesion between the developmental reinforcement and the actual skills they were going to need for Composition 1. And I do believe that has helped tremendously with attendance, because I think students feel like not only are their stakes greater if they're absent, but there is more to be gained by being in class, right? It becomes such a struggle to not be there because this stuff cannot be easily made up at home, and none of them want to, because all of the support is there in class. So not only have we seen greater passage rates, but the attendance problem has also improved a lot.
I just want to add too really quickly that of the 14 students that I had in the fall, 4 of them chose to take Comp 2 with me this semester. And I'm happy to say that those 4 students are some of the highest performing students in my Comp 2 classes this semester, because they sort of know what to expect from me, but they have a firm grasp of the writing process as well.
Yeah.
Even though we don't do the self-grading in Comp 2, I've seen these students who sit there and they're editing their papers in class much more rigorously than I'm seeing some of the students who did not take the CW class with me in the fall, because they know exactly what to expect. So in that sense, I feel like the class is a success.
Right. The other way that we are working with structuring it is so I mentioned there were 2 people out of 16 sections of these classes that failed for the work that they turned in, not because of attendance issues. Both of those students, based on my individual conversations with the instructors felt that the students had satisfied enough of the requirements to progress into just the 3-credit composition 1 class. So they did not repeat the 6-credit version or the 4-credit version. We had one that failed in the 4-credit and one that failed in the 6-credit, but they are both in the 3-credit standard composition 1 this semester, and they are both doing very well. So I'm going to be very interested going forward to track how our students do in composition 2. Kevin's just given us anecdotal data to tell us that what he sees so far is going well, but I am tracking it institutionally so that we know how they're progressing in composition 2. What will be more difficult to track, but I'm going to be interested in trying to track, is how they do in other classes outside of English as well, because for so many years they were held from taking those classes before successfully completing the developmental course. So that will be another indicator of the success of the classes.
Sorry to interrupt. We are at 5 minutes till the end. There are no questions yet in the Q&A posted, but if you would like to invite questions at this time, please feel free to do so.
Absolutely. We would love to have any questions that anyone has.
Yeah.
If there are no questions, we are happy to wrap up. That was everything that we had to talk about. So anyone has any questions? Great. If not, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you so much. We appreciate all of your time today. And thank you so much, Laura Driver and Kevin Moore. We thank you, professors, for all the valuable information that you shared with us. So IES 2023 continues tomorrow at 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time with a virtual tour of the St. Patrick's Day Parade in Dublin. More details and the full Friday schedule can be found on the conference website. While accessing the conference website, don't forget to swing by the virtual exhibit hall to say hello to the Hawks team. And while there, you can view a quick 5-minute demonstration, request your t-shirt, and be entered to win a $50 hourly giveaway. Also, in the spirit of St. Patrick's Day, you'll find a few golden coins throughout the conference website. So click on the coins to be entered to win an additional raffle. We will see you at the next session. And thanks again for joining day 1 of IES 2023. We can't wait to see everyone tomorrow.
Thank you.